building with Logan's question was, is the O3 air unit worth it? Is the O3 air unit worth it? Thank you, Guillermo. Why did Guillermo's message pop up? Is the O3 air unit worth it? So first of all, let's just look at, because worth it is subjective, right? Some people don't think that digital is worth it. They just fly analog and they're like, it's not worth it. So let's acknowledge that there's no objective answer to that. One thing I like to do when I ask this question is I look at, are other people buying this product and loving it? So if my initial reaction to something like that is, no, it's not worth it, but then I see that everybody and their brother's buying it and loving it, I have to acknowledge that to some people, it's definitely worth it. Now, I'm not saying that is my reaction, but the O3 air unit is, what is it at, 220 now? 220, I believe. Let me just double check that. DJI O3 air unit, $230, compared to about $160 for a V2 system. Since you're already in the range where you're paying that much money, I'm gonna guess that for most people who would pay, say, $160 for the V2 system, they're gonna be able to stretch to get up to that $230. That's an additional $60. $260, $160, $40, $70. Sorry. That's a fair whack up. Maybe that would lock some people out. The advantage of the O3 air unit is significantly better image detail and resolution. And I don't mean just because the O3 air unit is capable of outputting 1080p or 810p, while the V2 system only outputs 720p. And by the way, the difference between 720 and 810 is pretty small, but it exists. The difference between 720 and 1080 is definitely noticeable. I think that the O3 just generally does a better job with the bitrate that it has. Maybe that's because it uses H.265 encoding instead of H.264 like the V2 system. I don't know, but generally I do think you're getting a noticeable, certainly at least noticeable, some people would say significant, I would say at least noticeable uptick in image resolution and detail. You also, I think you're getting a noticeable uptick in range and penetration. And I don't know how, if they just have made it better. If there's one thing I've learned about DJI, it's that today they will release a product that makes you go, damn, that's pretty good. DJI, nice work. And then 2 years later, they'll release another product, and you'll go, "Whoa, you made it better." I mean, I was already impressed, and now somehow you raised the bar again, and they really do have an ability to keep raising the bar when already they've done things that other people would say are out of reach. I mean, yeah. I think not everybody is going to love them. Not everybody's going to want what they're selling. But I do think from a technical perspective, they consistently raise the bar. And they've done that with the O3 system. The downside of the O3, though, and frankly, I haven't switched to the O3. Not that I like build new quadcopters for myself. Like, I'm not the guy who, as soon as a new thing comes out, I throw away all my quadcopters. I build 27 new ones. There are people out there who do that. They're like, I have to have the latest. I'm not talking about like normal people. I'm talking about professionals. They always want to have the latest. They always want to be on whatever the new hotness is. And their whole fleet will just be all O3s now. Fine. Just drop the money. I'm not that guy. But more importantly, the O3, the dynamic range is really bad. The dynamic range is really bad. And honestly, I'm going to see if I can find... I'm going to see if I can find some footage for you, just that demonstrates this a little bit. I mean, if you've flown it, I think you know what I'm talking about, but... Here we go. Like, this is just a random flight that I grabbed. And when I say the dynamic range is really bad, Dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the brightest values that the camera can display. So I don't just mean that the shadows are dark. So for example, hold on, let me just screen grab this. I'll just take this exact frame and I'm going to bring it into Photoshop. 507RC, I know about this new firmware. I want to talk about that too. Hold on. But let's just work through this. Hello, Photoshop, where are you? Photoshop has decided not to. What are we doing? Why is Photoshop not starting? Photoshop, what's wrong with you? Come on. Come on, baby. There we go. So people are suggesting that it has to do with the exposure, and it does somewhat, but also somewhat not. I don't think it's 100% a problem with the exposure. Sit tight 1 second here. Photoshop, come on, baby. Work with me here. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I've got a screen grab of this image, and you see how there's just no detail here in the shadows. We've lost a lot of detail in the shadows. Now, if the problem was one of exposure, then what we could do, hang on, is we could bring it in and we could adjust the exposure. I'm going to do that right now. So here we are, and we're going to adjust the exposure. So for example, I can try and lift these shadows. And you see that as I lift the shadows, I am getting some of that detail back. That's actually pretty good. Now I've had to raise the shadows all the way up, and you can see that we've got a ton of grain or noise here. Hello, zoom in here. We've got a ton of noise here, right? It's looking pretty bad, but I was able to kind of recover this just by lifting the shadows all the way up. I did bring back that detail. Now this is a relatively low contrast image because it's a cloudy day, but we're already kind of at the limit of what the camera can do. I wonder if I have a shot from a sunnier day. I don't, not that day. What about 03? '03 was, oh, is this a sunny day? I see blue sky. Oh, I see blue sky. Okay, let's try this image. Let's see if we can demonstrate this. Talking about why the '03 camera, the biggest problem with the '03 camera. So here's another image from a sunnier day. Again, just a random image grab. Let's see what happens if we try to lift the shadows on this one. Well, I got a little bit of detail back. That's actually a little better than I was expecting. Let's try one more. Let's see if I can find a one where the sun is in the sky and the ground is super dark as a result. Okay, this is a worst case scenario, but let's see if we can demonstrate the point. All right, so this is a worst case scenario because we're pointed right at the sky. If we lift the shadows on this, what happens? Damn. Actually, that's I gotta say, this is the first, literally this is the first time I've done this experiment. I've been thinking about making a video about this for a little while, and I haven't actually tested this. I'm kind of actually impressed. I expected there to be less detail there than there actually is. There actually is detail in the shadows. Holy shit. Look right here, if you don't know what I mean by that. As I raise the exposure, we have information here. It's not just that it's black there. The information is there. That's really interesting. So what I was going to say is the dynamic range on the camera is really bad, and because the dynamic range is bad, you're going to lose shadow detail or lose highlight detail. Adjusting the camera's exposure algorithm can't fix that. If you only have this much dynamic range, you can move that window up or down to change the exposure, but you can't widen that value. But it actually seems like it has more dynamic range than it's giving us, and maybe if we were to do something like a new sort of tone mapping, we could get some of that shadow detail back. The V2 cameras, for whatever reason, the V2 cameras seem to have much better dynamic range than the O3 and seem to give you more information as a pilot when you're flying into a dark area. So that would be another reason to prefer the V2. I got to try this new firmware because maybe they actually have more information to give than they're actually giving us. The other thing this new firmware does is it gives 10-bit mode, which if the information is there, could help. Brandon Beans, that was not DCine-alike, and it was not post-update. That was standard color. Ghost Branch FPV says, what you're doing there paints a completely wrong picture. If you were to apply this to a full video, the exposure algorithm would ruin it. Ghost Branch, that's a very good point. You could set the exposure correctly for a single frame, but then if you have to turn that exposure up for one frame, it'll be overexposed in another. DJI still needs to improve their exposure algorithm. But my question was, if the camera doesn't have enough dynamic range, there's really not a lot you can do to fix that. You could try and work around it, but at the end of the day, a camera with more dynamic range will generally do a better job. So other reasons that you might stay away from the O3, mounting it in the frame. Not all frames really do a great job with the camera mounting. The camera is very difficult to mount in such a way that it doesn't stick out and get damaged versus having standoffs in view. Manufacturers will eventually solve this with custom frames, but for the time being, it's still... What does he mean by the V2 camera? I mean, like the Vista video transmitter, the Runcam Falcon, the Runcam Link, the Caddx Vista, the original DJI camera, the Nebula Pro, all of those cameras from the V2 system before the O3, basically. The question is, can they fix it with firmware? Well, that just depends on the capabilities of the sensor. What determines a camera's dynamic range, asks Timberline. Camera's dynamic range, this is a question that I'm not qualified to answer because I have seen people who aren't good, who know about cameras, discuss the answer, and it is a very complicated question with many, many facets, and I don't know what all of them are, but the camera's dynamic range is related to the design of the camera more so than like the firmware. Things like the size of the photo sites on the sensor. One of the things that people are confused by is they say the O3, and I've said this until somebody set me straight, and I was like, oh, that's very interesting. I was very confused that the O3 camera seems to have worse dynamic range than the V2 cameras because the O3 has a much bigger sensor. And generally, a bigger sensor will have larger photo sites, and therefore will have more sensitivity and or better dynamic range. But the O3 sensor is a 4K sensor, and the V2 cameras are a 720p sensor. So although the O3 camera sensor is bigger, it has denser photo sites, and the photo sites are actually smaller. I did the math. I don't remember the exact ratio, but that's not the only thing that affects dynamic range, but it does play into it. So, anyway, is the O3 camera worth it? After 20 minutes of debate discussing this, I think it's a really interesting topic. I think that for a lot of people it is, just if only because it does give you good enough. It gives you good 1080. It could do 4K onboard recording. If it lets you get rid of your GoPro, it's 1,000% worth it. It's just a question of whether the low light sensitivity, which by the way is also pretty poor, and the dynamic range and the exposure algorithm work for you while you're flying. And that's very difficult to answer until you try it.